Where do you feel most at home? Where are you finding your safety and your comfort and your rest? In Psalm 31, David is finding his refuge in the Lord his God. As often seems to be the case, David is on the run and he's fleeing from enemies under great distress, and yet he remains at home in the Lord. In verses 1 through 8, we see that he remembers how God has been a refuge to him in the past. For example, in verse 7, he says, I will rejoice and be glad in your steadfast love, because you have seen my affliction. You have known the distress of my soul. Then in verses 9 through 18, he looks to God as his present refuge. David is filled with distress and grief and sorrow and sighing, and yet he trusts in the Lord. In fact, in verse 15, he even says, my times are in your hand. And then in the final 5 verses, David hopes in God to be a refuge for him in the future. In verse 19, God's goodness is stored up and ready to work on David's behalf. And so David clings to the promise that God will preserve him, which enables him to wait upon the Lord. This psalm ultimately is designed to show us how Jesus entrusted himself to the Father and sought refuge in him during his earthly sojourn here in this world. Jesus was a suffering servant who experienced distress and affliction for sure. His life was spent with sorrow and his years with sighing. And his adversaries made him a reproach, didn't they? The scribes and the Pharisees schemed together against Jesus. They hid a net for him and ultimately had him crucified. And then, as a sin offering, Jesus bore all the sins of his people. You can imagine Jesus saying, verse 10, my strength fails because of my iniquity, and my bones are wasted away. Now, Jesus didn't suffer for sins that he committed in his person. May it never be. But he did identify with our sins to the extent that he was willing to personally receive our punishment. That's the beauty of the gospel, isn't it? Well, what made it possible for Jesus to live with courage and endure the cross? He waited on his Father and sought refuge in him. He found his home in God himself. So how about you? What's causing you to sigh today? Are you surrounded by people who reject the gospel that you so dearly love and treasure? Are you being judged for insisting that the church regather during this lingering time of pandemic? Because the church is where you feel most at home. Well, let this psalm be an encouragement to you. Love the Lord. Be strong and let your heart take courage. Wait upon the Lord and seek him to be your refuge.